Good morning, everybody. Um, Last video was I was talking about Matthew chapter 1, um, verse 23, and the prophecy of Emmanuel and how it tied into the birth of Yahusha, or rather, how it didn't quite fit. It didn't fit at all. And today, I'm in Matthew chapter 2. And Matthew chapter 2, there was a lot of studying that went into this. So I've got a lot of different things going on in my mind with this chapter and all the studying and stuff that went into it. So it'll probably be a 2-part video just to avoid the video running for just hours and hours. So I'm going to read Matthew chapter 2, verse 1 through 8. It says, Now when Yahusha was born in Bethlehem of Jehud, in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came Magi from the east to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he that is born king of the Yahudim? For we have seen his star rising in the east, and are come to worship him. When Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where Mashiach should be born. And they said unto him, In Bethlehem of Jehud. For thus it is written by the prophet, And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Yehuda, are not the least among the princes of Yehuda. For out of you shall come a governor that shall rule my people Yashael, Israel. Then Herod, when he had privately called the Magi, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, and said, Go and search diligently for the young child, and when ye have found him, bring me word again, that I may come and worship him also. Now, where the question first started is verse 6. I mean, there were other questions within these few verses about the star and, some other things. But right now, my focus is on verse 6. And it says, And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Yehuda, are not the least among the princes of Yehuda. For out of you shall come a governor that shall rule my people Yashael. Now, from what it's saying here, these Magi are quoting this prophecy as if this was about Yahusha. But Yahusha wasn't a governor. He didn't rule Israel at all. And whenever the Father gave a prophecy and said, this is going to happen, this shall happen, it happened. There was no ifs, there was no maybes, there was no mights. If the Father said it was going to happen, it happened. Yahusha didn't rule over Israel. He didn't rule over the people of Israel. He wasn't a governor. So that's the first thing where it's like, okay, how did we get to that being about Yahusha? So then we get to looking for where this prophecy came from, and it came from Micah, and it's Micah chapter 5, and it has it listed here as verse 2. Let me see. It says, I'm going to read Micah 5, 1 through 5, just because I do that so that I can get a better understanding, and maybe it'll help you guys follow along with where my line of thinking is coming from. Says, And you, O Bethlehem of Ephrath, least among the clans of Judah, from you one shall come forth to rule Israel for me, one whose origin is from of old, from ancient times. Truly, he, meaning the Lord, will leave them helpless until she who is to bear has born. Then the rest of his countrymen shall return to the children of Israel. He shall stand and shepherd by the might of the Lord, by the power of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall dwell secure. For lo, he shall wax great to the ends of the earth, and that shall afford safety. Should Assyria invade our land and tread upon our fortresses, we will set up over it 7 shepherds, 8 princes of men, who will shepherd Assyria's land with swords, the land of Nimrod in its gates. Thus he will deliver us from Assyria should it invade our land and should it trample our country. Now, what's interesting about this is that, again, we're back to dealing with Assyria. This prophecy is about Assyria and what Assyria was doing as far as their kings and attacking Jerusalem and attacking Israel. Now, in the previous video, we were talking about King Ahaz and what was going on with him. Micah, which is the prophet that's speaking right now, Micah, he gave his prophecies during the time of King Jotham, King Ahaz, and King Hezekiah. Okay. Now, this passage of scripture, Micah 5:1-5, I'm pretty sure is about Hezekiah and doesn't have anything to do with Yahusha, just because of the time frame and what was going on as far as Assyria and Hezekiah. Because Ahaz, Hezekiah's father, who preceded him, he enlisted the help of Assyria, the king of Assyria, Tiglath-Pileser, to help him fight against Remaliah, who was the king of Aram, and Pekah, the king of Israel, because Pekah and Remaliah had joined together to attack King Ahaz, because Ahaz wouldn't fight with them against the king of Assyria. Instead of him joining with his brethren, he hired the king of Assyria to fight his brethren for him. And in the end result of that was Judah becoming a vassal to the king of Assyria. They had to pay Assyria tribute. Well, by the time Hezekiah came around, Hezekiah wasn't doing that anymore. He rebelled against the king of Assyria, who by this time was King Sennacherib, and he said, "I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. I'm not going to serve you guys anymore." And so Assyria, the king of Assyria, he decided he was going to attack them, and he sent three military people to go and basically to make a lot of threats against Judah and against Jerusalem. And those threats that he made were against the Father. He compared Yahuwah to all these false gods of other nations that he had already conquered, and said if their gods couldn't save them, y'all's king is seducing y'all into death by telling you guys that y'all's God is going to protect y'all from me. I want this land and you're going to give it to me. You're going to be delivered into my hands. Your God is not going to save you. This is the boast that these people are making. But anyway, we've gotten a little bit ahead. Going back to Micah 5, verse 1, because again, Matthew 2:6 says, "And you, Bethlehem, and the land of Judah, are not the least among the princes of Judah, for out of you shall come a governor that shall rule my people Israel." Now, once again, Yahusha didn't rule anybody. He didn't rule over anybody. He was not a governor. He was not a king. He did not rule over anything. And so now we're back at Micah chapter 5, verse 1, and it says, "And you, O Bethlehem of Ephrath, least among the clans of Judah, from you one shall come forth to rule Israel for me, one whose origin is from of old, from ancient times." Now, it says that the origin of this, basically the origin of this king's bloodline, the origin of this governor's bloodline that's supposed to come out of Bethlehem, that the origin of that bloodline is from ancient days, not from the beginning, but from ancient days, meaning that, centuries ago this bloodline was established according to their time, centuries before their time, where this prophecy is being given, is what I mean. But one of the clues, you have to kind of go back and see what the bloodline of Bethlehem and of Ephrath and all that. You have to go back to see what that's kind of talking about. And one of the scriptures where it talks about them is 1 Samuel 17, and then there's another one in Ruth chapter 4 and in Genesis 38. So we're going to go back and then go back a little further and then go back a little further than that. So we're going to start in 1 Samuel 17. Let's see. 1 Samuel 17 and verse 12. David was the son of a certain Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, whose name was Jesse. He had 8 sons, and in the days of Saul, the man was already old, advanced in years. So Jesse, who was David's father, David was the one that ended up becoming king, and his line is the procession of the kings of Judah, because in the days of Jeroboam, they broke away. Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, broke away from the house of David, and it wasn't a good thing. He split the kingdom, and basically rebelled against the house of David. Said we're not going to follow the house of David anymore. So the house of David continued to rule over Judah, and Israel split. Okay, so this is about David's line. That much we know. This is about David's line. And it says that in the days of King Saul, who was the first king of Israel, Jesse was already old. Jesse was already old. And this was several kings in the past. Saul was several kings ago. Many kings ago was Saul. Okay. And so in his days, Jesse was already old. He had 8 sons. One of them was David. Now we're going to go to Ruth. So we're going to go back even further to see where that bloodline, how far back does that bloodline really go? Okay. Ruth 1 says, "In the days when the chieftains ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah, with his wife and 2 sons, went to reside in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and his 2 sons were named Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. They came to the country of Moab and remained there. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth, and they lived there about 10 years. Then those 2, Mahlon and Chilion, also died, so the woman was left without her 2 sons and without her husband. She started out with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for in the country of Moab she had heard that the Lord had taken note of his people and given them food. Accompanied by her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living, which was Moab, And they set out on the road back to the land of Judah. So they were going back to Bethlehem. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Turn back, each of you, to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that each of you find security in the house of a husband." And she kissed them farewell. They broke into weeping and said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi replied, "Turn back, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I any more sons in my body who might be husbands for you? Turn back, my daughters, for I am too old to be married. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I were married tonight and I also bore sons, should you wait for them to grow up? Should you, on their account, debar yourselves from marriage? Oh no, my daughters, my lot is far more bitter than yours, for the hand of the Lord has struck out against me." They broke into weeping again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law farewell. But Ruth clung to her. So she said, "See, your sister-in-law has returned to her people and her gods. Go follow your sister-in-law." But Ruth replied, "Do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go wherever you lodge. I will lodge, your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus and more may the Lord do to me, if anything but death parts me from you." When Naomi saw how determined she was to go with her, she ceased to argue with her, and the two went on until they reached Bethlehem. Sorry, guys. Had to pause for the cause. But now we're moving on. Ruth, once her and Naomi got to Bethlehem, Ruth ended up being kind of wittingly introduced to Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's deceased husband. And they ended up getting married. Ruth and Boaz got married and had a son. And now we're in Ruth 4, verse 11. It says, "All the people at the gate and the elders answered, 'We are. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built up the house of Israel. Prosper in Ephrathah and perpetuate your name in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman.' So Boaz married Ruth. She became his wife, and he cohabited with her. The Lord let her conceive, and she bore a son. And the women said to Naomi, 'Blessed be the Lord, who has not withheld a redeemer from you today. May his name be perpetuated in Israel. He will renew your life and sustain your old age. For he is born of your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons.' Naomi took the child and held it to her bosom. She became its foster mother, and the women neighbors gave him a name, saying, 'A son is born to Naomi.' They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, father of David. This is the line of Perez. Perez begot Hezron. Hezron begot Ram. Ram begot Amminadab. Amminadab begot Nahshon. Nahshon begot Salma. Salma begot Boaz. Boaz begot Obed. Obed begot Jesse. And Jesse begot David." So going back to Perez, this was an ancient bloodline, because Perez was one of Judah's sons. We learned about him in Genesis and how he came about. Matter of fact, let's go there. Genesis 38. And I think I'm going to read all of Genesis 38 just because I like Genesis 38. Okay. Genesis 38. About that time, Judah left his brothers and camped near a certain Adulamite whose name was Hirah. There, Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he married her and cohabited with her. She conceived and bore a son, and he named him She conceived again and bore a son, and named him Onan. Once again she bore a son, and named him Shelah. He was at Kezib when she bore him. Judah got a wife for his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was displeasing to the Lord, and the Lord took his life. Then Judah said to Onan, "Join with your brother's wife, and do your duty by her as a brother-in-law, and provide offspring for your brother." But Onan, knowing that the seed would not count as his, let it go to waste, whenever he joined with his brother's wife, so as not to provide offspring for his brother. What he did was displeasing to the Lord, and he took his life also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Stay as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up." For he thought he too might die like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. A long time afterwards, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. When his period of mourning was over, Judah went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, together with his friend Hirah the Adulamite. And Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is coming up to Timnah for the sheep shearing." So she took off her widow's garb, covered her face with a veil, and wrapping herself up, sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, yet she had not been given to him as wife. When Judah saw her, he took her for a harlot, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, "Here, let me sleep with you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. "What," she asked, "will you pay for sleeping with me?" He replied, "I will send a kid from my flock." But she said, "You must leave a pledge until you have sent it." And he said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your seal and cord and the staff which you carry. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she conceived by him. Then she went on her way. She took off her veil and again put on her widow's garb. Judah sent the kid by his friend the Adulamite to redeem the pledge from the woman, but he could not find her. He inquired of the people of that town, "Where is the cult prostitute, the one at Enaim by the road?" But they said, "There has been no prostitute here." Not only did he think she was a prostitute, he thought she was a cult prostitute. He thought she was a temple whore. I'm sorry, but that's funny to me. Our people, what was wrong with them? Anyway. There has been no prostitute here. So he returned to Judah and said, "I could not find her. Moreover, the townspeople said, 'There has been no prostitute here.' Judah said, 'Let her keep them, lest we become a laughingstock.' I did send her this kid, but you did not find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot. In fact, she is with child by harlotry." "Bring her out," said Judah, "and let her be burned." As she was being brought out, she sent this message to her father-in-law, "I am with child by the man to whom these belong." And she added, "Examine these. Whose seal and cord and staff are these?" Judah recognized them and said, "She is more in the right than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he was not intimate with her again." When the time came for her to give birth, there were twins in her womb. While she was in labor, one of them put out his hand, and the midwife tied a crimson thread on that hand to signify, "This one came out first." But just then he drew back his hand, and out came his brother. And she said, "What a breach you made for yourself." So he was named Perez. Afterward, his brother came out, on whose hand was the crimson thread, and he was named Zerah. So the origin of this of this child from Bethlehem, this ruler that was supposed to come out of Bethlehem of Ephrath, that origin, that bloodline goes back a ways. A ways. So it would have gone back to ancient times as far as they were concerned. That bloodline went back to ancient times. But Perez was not before Abraham. And that's not what it says. So he didn't come from the time of the beginning. This bloodline, whoever this ruler was supposed to come. Basically, all it was saying was that he was going to come through the line of David. He was going to be one of the kings of Judah. That's first. Okay. Now we're going to go back to Micah chapter 5, because there was so much going on here with not necessarily with this passage, but just with Assyria in general. Assyria deported the people of Aram, the city of Damascus. He deported those people, the Edomites and all those that were living there in Damascus. When King Tiglath-Pileser killed the king of Aram. Excuse me. And then later on, I believe it was King Sennacherib or King Shalmaneser, one of the two. I think it was King Sennacherib that deported the people of Samaria and deported them to different lands in Assyria during the reign of King Hoshea, who's the one who conspired against King Pekah and killed King Pekah about 8 years after he was no longer in charge anyway. Because by the time King Ahaz came along, King Pekah only had 3 years left to rule. And then 8 years after those 3 years were over, Hoshea killed him, and Hoshea became king. And 9 years into his reign, the rest of Samaria got deported. And so now we're dealing with Hezekiah. After Ahaz has died, his son Hezekiah became king. And Hezekiah, it said that he did things that were, he pleased the Father, and there was no other king like him. And how much he pleased the Father. There was no other king like him. His story, I believe, it starts in, because it talks about King Hezekiah in Chronicles. It talks about him in 2 Kings. It talks about him in Isaiah. Isaiah was another prophet that was prophesying about some of the things that were going on during King Hezekiah's reign. And it was all about Assyria and how he was basically, because of his faith and his trust in the Father alone, he was going to be able to basically defend his people against Assyria. So we're going to read Micah 5 again, verses 1 through 5. And I'll probably read on a little bit. Read through verse 9. Read through verse 8. It says, "And you, O Bethlehem of Ephrath, least among the clans of Judah, from you one shall come forth to rule Israel for me, one whose origin is from of old, from ancient times. Truly he will leave them helpless until she who is to bear has borne. Then the rest of his countrymen shall return to the children of Israel. He shall stand and shepherd by the might of the Lord, by the power of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall dwell secure. For lo, he shall wax great to the ends of the earth, and that shall afford safety. Should Assyria invade our land and tread upon our fortresses, we will set up over it 7 shepherds, 8 princes of men, who will shepherd Assyria's land with swords, the land of Nimrod in its gates. Thus he will deliver us from Assyria, should it invade our land, and should it trample our country." Again, all of this goes together. This is all talking about the same person that was supposed to come out of Bethlehem of Ephraim to rule Israel for the Father. All of that was about this one person. Yahushua didn't do any of that. He didn't do any of that. He didn't fight anybody. They weren't being attacked by Assyria. And none of what was going on in Yahushua's day had anything to do with Assyria. They were dealing with Greece and Rome. Nothing that they had going on nothing that they had going on in Yahushua's day had anything to do with Assyria. By that time, the Assyrians had been conquered by the Babylonians, and Babylon had taken over all of the Assyrian provinces that were in Israel and Judah, and then deported the remnant that was back in Jerusalem and back in Israel at that time to Babylon. So, we're going to read on. Verse 6 through verse 8. It says, "The remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of the many peoples, like dew from the Lord, like droplets on grass, which do not look to any man, nor place their hope in mortals. The remnant of Jacob shall be among the nations, in the midst of the many peoples, like a lion among beasts of the wild, like a fierce lion among flocks of sheep, which tramples wherever it goes, and rends with none to deliver. Your hand shall prevail over your foes, and all your enemies shall be cut down in that day, declares the Lord." Again, in the days of Yahushua, Israel wasn't cutting down nobody. Judah wasn't cutting down anybody. They didn't have a king anymore. They didn't have, that's not what they had. They had Herod, but he wasn't even, that's a whole nother study. That's a whole nother lesson. That's a whole nother video. We're not going there right now. But anyway, back to this prophecy in Matthew chapter 2, verse 6, where it says that this ruler was going to come out of Bethlehem of Ephraim and was going to rule over Israel and basically do all this great fighting for his people. There was going to be, it didn't happen. And at that time, I think Yahushua was sending forth people to go and gather the lost sheep. Back to the fishers of men. He was a fisherman. He was going to be a fisher of men. But this prophecy was about the remnant of Jacob returning after dealing with Assyria. All that happened in Hezekiah's reign. Hezekiah was, the last one, because, the father did some great things through Hezekiah because of Hezekiah's faith and belief in the Father, and knowing that we're going to trust in God and God alone, because he is God all by himself, and we're not going to serve anything else. He tore down a bunch of altars and shrines and all this good stuff that he did. And so, that's kind of where we're at with that. Let me see. 2 Chronicles 32 and 8. Well, first I'm going to read Micah 5 and 3. It says, "He shall stand and shepherd by the might of the Lord, by the power of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall dwell secure. For lo, he shall wax great to the ends of the earth. For lo, he shall wax great to the ends of the earth." Now we're going to go to 2 Chronicles 32 in verse 21 through 23. Give me a second. Okay. know what? I'm going to read all of 30. Well, not all of it. I'm going to read 1 through 23, just so we can see where I'm going with this. After these faithful deeds, King Sennacherib of Assyria invaded Judah and encamped against its fortified towns with the aim of taking them over. When Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come, intent on making war against Jerusalem, he consulted with his officers and warriors about stopping the flow of the springs outside the city, and they supported him. A large force was assembled to stop up all the springs and the wadi that flowed through the land, for otherwise they thought the king of Assyria would come and find water in abundance. He acted with vigor, rebuilding the whole breached wall, raising towers on it, and building another wall outside it. He fortified the millow of the city of David and made a great quantity of arms and shields. He appointed battle officers over the people. Then, gathering them to him in the square of the city gate, he rallied them, saying, "Be strong and of good courage. Do not be frightened or dismayed by the king of Assyria or by the horde that is with him. For we have more with us than he has with him. With him is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles." There goes that Emmanuel again. With us is God. To do what? To help us and fight our battles. The people were encouraged by the speech of King Hezekiah of Judah. After King Sennacherib of Assyria sent his officers to Jerusalem, he and all his staff being at Lachish with this message to King Hezekiah of Judah and to all the people of Judah who were in Jerusalem, thus said King Sennacherib of Assyria, "On what do you trust to enable you to endure a siege in Jerusalem? Hezekiah is seducing you to a death of hunger and thirst, saying the Lord our God will save us from the king of Assyria. But is not Hezekiah the one who removed his shrines and his altars and commanded the people of Judah and Jerusalem, saying, before this one altar you shall prostrate yourselves, and upon it make your burnt offerings? Surely you know what I and my fathers have done to the peoples of the lands. Were the gods of the nations of the lands able to save their lands from me? Which of all of the gods of any of those nations whom my fathers destroyed was able to save his people from me, that your God should be able to save you from me? Now then, do not let Hezekiah delude you. Do not let him seduce you in this way. Do not believe him. For no God of any nation or kingdom has been able to save his people from me or from my fathers, much less your God to save you from me." His officers said still more things against the Lord God and against his servant Hezekiah. He also wrote letters reviling the Lord God of Israel, saying of him, just as the gods of the other nations of the earth did not save their people from me, so the God of Hezekiah will not save his people from me. They called loudly in the language of Judah to the people of Jerusalem who were on the wall, to frighten them into panic, so as to capture the city. They spoke of the God of Jerusalem as though he were like the gods of the other peoples of the earth, made by human hands. Then King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah, son of Amos, prayed about this and cried out to heaven. The Lord sent an angel who annihilated every mighty warrior, commander, and officer in the army of the king of Assyria, and he returned in disgrace to his land. He entered the house of his God, and there some of his own offspring struck him down by the sword. Thus the Lord delivered Hezekiah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem from King Sennacherib of Assyria, and from everyone he provided for them on all sides. Many brought tribute to the Lord, to Jerusalem, and gifts to the king Hezekiah of Judah. Thereafter he was exalted in the eyes of all the nations. So, basically, according to Micah 5 and 3, 5 and 3, that part where it says, "For lo, he shall wax great to the ends of the earth." That's basically what happened. Because after all of this was all said and done, because of the way that Hezekiah handled the situation and went with the prophet Isaiah and prayed. And Father, he making all these grandiose boasts against you, and he talking about you like you one of these false gods out here. Father, do something about him, please. Not even for our sake, but because he dishonored you. Hey, you gonna let him talk about you like that? That's basically what Hezekiah did. And so, because the remnant was able to come back, because all of this was handled and taken care of, he became one of those kings that people revered and people loved. People of all nations is all nations. He was exalted in the eyes of all the nations. Now, all that exaltation caused him to get a little arrogant, and he got in trouble. But he humbled himself after that, after he got in trouble and got sick. And the Father gave him an extra 15 years in his life and told him that basically you guys are safe for right now, but in the years of your sons, the king of Babylon is coming. And y'all gonna all your sons and all them, they're gonna be carried off to Babylon. But from in that little time frame, they were safe because of Hezekiah's love for the Lord and his fear of the Lord. Now, it mentions Isaiah here, so I'm gonna go to Isaiah where it's talking about this in Isaiah, and it is Isaiah 36 and 37. Which is one of the reasons why this Matthew 2 is probably going to be a two-part video, just because there's a lot of scripture reading that goes into Matthew 2, because I'm still trying to figure out why all these different things are being said about Yahusha that should not have been said. Whether he was, regardless of who he was or who he was supposed to be, he wasn't who he was supposed to be. If we're going to go by these prophecies that so far that we're coming across in Matthew, they don't add up to having had anything to do with him at all. They don't add up. And so we're still trying to get to the bottom of how he came into the picture. Where did he come from? Where did the new covenant come from? Where did all that stuff come from? That's what we're trying to get to. But right now, we're still talking about how this prophecy was about Hezekiah. So, we're going to Isaiah 36. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, King Sennacherib of Assyria marched against all the fortified towns of Judah and seized them. From Lachish, the king of Assyria sent the Rabshakeh with a large force to King Hezekiah in Jerusalem. The Rabshakeh took up a position near the conduit of the upper pool by the road of the fuller's field, and Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, who was in charge of the palace, Shebna the scribe, and Joah, son of Asaph the recorder, went out to him. The Rabshakeh said to them, "You tell Hezekiah, thus said the great king, the king of Assyria, what makes you so confident? I suppose mere talk makes counsel and valor for war. Look, on whom are you relying that you have rebelled against me? You are relying on Egypt, that splintered reed of a staff which enters and punctures the palm of anyone who leans on it. That's what Pharaoh, king of Egypt, is like to all who rely on him. And if you tell me that you are relying on the Lord your God, he is the very one whose shrines and altars Hezekiah did away with, telling Judah and Jerusalem, you must worship only at this altar. Come now, make this wager with my master, the king of Assyria. I'll give you 2,000 horses if you can produce riders to mount them. So how could you refuse anything, even to the deputy of one of my master's lesser servants, relying on Egypt for chariots and horsemen? And do you think I have marched against this land to destroy it without the Lord? The Lord himself told me, go up against that land and destroy it." Eliakim, Shebna, and Joah replied to the Rabshakeh, Please speak to your servants in Aramaic, since we understand it. Do not speak to us in Judean in the hearing of the people on the wall. But the Rabshakeh replied, Was it to your master and to you that my master sent me to speak those words? It was precisely to the men who are sitting on the wall, who will have to eat their dung and drink their urine with you. And the Rabshakeh stood and called out in a loud voice in Judean, Hear the words of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus said the king, Don't let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to save you. Don't let Hezekiah make you rely on the Lord, saying, The Lord will surely save us. This city will not fall into the hands of Assyria. Don't listen to Hezekiah, for thus said the king of Assyria, Make your peace with me and come out to me, so that you may all eat from your vines and your fig trees and drink water from your cisterns, until I come and take you away to a land like your own, a land of bread and wine, of grain fields and vineyards. Beware of letting Hezekiah mislead you by saying, The Lord will save us. Did any of the gods of the other nations save his land from the king of Assyria? Where were the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where were the gods of Sepharvaim? And did they save Samaria from me? Which among all the gods of those countries saved their countries from me, that the Lord should save Jerusalem from me? But they were silent and did not answer him with a single word, for the king's order was, Do not answer him. And so Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, who was in charge of the palace, Shebna the scribe, and Joah, son of Asaph, the recorder, came to Hezekiah with their clothes rent, and they reported to him what the Rabshakeh had said. When King Hezekiah heard this, he rent his clothes and covered himself with sackcloth, and went into the house of the Lord. He also sent Eliakim, who was in charge of the palace, Shebna the scribe, and the senior priest, covered with sackcloth, to the prophet Isaiah, son of Amos. They said to him, Thus said Hezekiah, This day is a day of distress, of chastisement, and of disgrace. The babes have reached the birth stool, and the strength to give birth is lacking. So the one who is to bear it hadn't born yet. Perhaps the Lord your God will take note of the words of the Rabshakeh, whom his master, the king of Assyria, had sent to blaspheme the living God, and will mete out judgment for the words that the Lord your God has heard, if you will offer up prayer for the surviving remnant. When King Hezekiah's ministers came to Isaiah, Isaiah said to them, Tell your master as follows, Thus said the Lord, Do not be frightened by the words of blasphemy against me that you have heard from the minions of the king of Assyria. I will delude him. He will hear a rumor and return to his land, and I will make him fall by the sword in his land. The Rabshakeh, meanwhile, heard that the king had left Lachish. He turned back and found the king of Assyria attacking Libnah. But the king of Assyria learned that King Tirhakah of Nubia, Ethiopia, had come out to fight him. And when he heard it, he sent messengers to Hezekiah, saying, Tell this to King Hezekiah of Judah. Do not let your God on whom you are relying mislead you into thinking that Jerusalem will not be delivered into the hands of the king of Assyria. You yourself have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all the lands, how they have annihilated them. And can you escape? Were the nations that my predecessors destroyed, Gozan, Haran, Rezeph, and the Bethedanites in Telasar, saved by their gods? Where is the king of Hamath, and the king of Arpad, and the kings of Lair, Sepharvaim, Hena, and Ivah? Hezekiah received the letter from the messengers and read it. Hezekiah then went up to the house of the Lord and spread it out before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, O Lord of hosts, enthroned on the cherubim, you alone are God of all the kingdoms of the earth. You made the heavens and the earth. O Lord, incline your ear and hear. Open your eye and see. Hear all the words the Sennacherib has sent to blaspheme the living God. True, O Lord, the kings of Assyria have annihilated all the nations and their lands, and have committed their gods to the flames and have destroyed them. For they are not gods, but man's handiwork of wood and stone. But now, O Lord our God, deliver us from his hands, and let all the kingdoms of the earth know that you, O Lord, alone are God. Then Isaiah, son of Amos, sent this message to Hezekiah. Thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, to whom you have prayed concerning King Sennacherib of Assyria. This is the word that the Lord has spoken concerning him. Fair maiden Zion despises you. She mocks at you. Fair Jerusalem shakes her head at you. Whom have you blasphemed and reviled? Against whom made loud your voice and haughtily raised your eyes? Against the Holy One of Israel. Through your servants you have blasphemed my Lord, because you thought, thanks to my vast chariotry, it is I who have climbed the highest mountains, to the remotest parts of the Lebanon, and have cut down its loftiest cedars, its choicest cypresses, and have reached its highest peak, its densest forest. It is I who have drawn and drunk water. I have dried up with the soles of my feet all the streams of Egypt. Have you not heard? Of old I planned that very thing. I designed it long ago, and now have fulfilled it. It has come to pass, laying fortified towns waste in desolate heaps. Their inhabitants are helpless, dismayed, and shamed. They were but grass of the field and green herbage, grass of the roofs that is blasted before the east wind. I know your stayings and your goings and comings, and how you have raged against me. Because you have raged against me, and your tumult has reached my ears, I will place my hook in your nose and my bit between your jaws, and I will make you go back by the road by which you came. Kind of sound like what he said to Job about Leviathan and pride. Anyway, and this is the sign for you. This year you eat what grows of itself, and the next year what springs from that, and in the third year sow and reap and plant vineyards and eat their fruit. And the survivors of the house of Judah that have escaped shall renew its trunk below and produce boughs above. For a remnant shall come forth from Jerusalem, survivors from Mount Zion. The zeal of the Lord of hosts shall bring this to pass. So again, this remnant, the remnant was going to come forth from Jerusalem, survivors from Mount Zion. They were going to eventually return. That's what was being prophesied, was that they were eventually going to return from when they were deported by Assyria, when Assyria had ransacked Israel and had, all that nonsense that was going on. The Father told them that a remnant was going to return. And that's what happened. That's what happened. Now, one of the things that it says in Isaiah 36 that King Sennacherib was upset about was that basically Judah had relied on Egypt, or at least that's how he felt. That's what he felt was going on. And that goes back to when King Ahaz had made that, he had basically hired one of the kings of Assyria, Tiglath-Pileser. He hired him to fight against Ephraim and against Samaria and Damascus, against King Ramaliah and King Pekah of Damascus and Samaria. And so Judah ended up having to become a vassal to Assyria. That was part of the deal. He had to pay them tribute. And he stopped doing that. Okay? He stopped doing that. King Hezekiah, when Hezekiah came around, he stopped doing that. Hold on, let's see. I'm going to start in 2 Kings 17. In the 12th year of King Ahaz of Judah, Hoshea, son of Elah, became king over Israel in Samaria for 9 years. He did what was displeasing to the Lord, though not as much as the kings of Israel who preceded him. King Shalmaneser marched against him, and Hoshea became his vassal and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria caught Hoshea in an act of treachery. He had sent envoys to King So of Egypt. Okay, so it wasn't Hezekiah that went to Egypt, but this is why the kings of Assyria were upset. Y'all were supposed to be a vassal to us, and you went and made this whatever little deal you got going on with Egypt. Where's my money? Where's my stuff that you're supposed to be giving me tribute? Where is it? And why are you going to Egypt to talk to the Pharaoh about anything? What are you going there for? Anyway, it says, but the king of Assyria caught Hoshea in an act of treachery. He had sent envoys to King So of Egypt, and he had not paid the tribute to the king of Assyria as in previous years. And the king of Assyria arrested him and put him in prison. Then the king of Assyria marched against the whole land. He came to Samaria and besieged it for 3 years. This right now, this is the king of Israel that he's fighting up against, King Hoshea. King Ahaz still paying that tribute. But right now, King Hoshea is not. King Ahaz was king of Judah, and Hoshea was king of Israel, or Samaria. So this is when Samaria is getting ready to be deported. The people of Samaria are getting ready to be deported. Okay. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. He deported the Israelites to Assyria and settled them in Halah at the river Habor, at the river Gozan, in the towns of Media. This happened because the Israelites sinned against the Lord their God, who had freed them from the land of Egypt, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods and followed the customs of the nations which the Lord had dispossessed before the Israelites, and the customs which the kings of Israel had practiced. The Israelites committed against the Lord their God acts which were not right. They built for themselves shrines in all their settlements, from watchtowers to fortified cities. They set up pillars and sacred posts for themselves on every lofty hill and under every leafy tree, and they offered sacrifices there at all the shrines, like the nations whom the Lord had driven into exile before them. They committed wicked acts to vex the Lord, and they worshipped fetishes, concerning which the Lord had said to them, "You must not do this thing." The Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, "Turn back from your wicked ways and observe my commandments and my laws, according to all the teaching that I commanded your fathers and that I transmitted to you through my servants the prophets." But they did not obey. They stiffened their necks, like their fathers who did not have faith in the Lord their God. They spurned his laws and the covenant that he had made with their fathers and the warnings he had given them. They went after delusion and were deluded. They imitated the nations that were about them, which the Lord had forbidden them to emulate.
I'm sorry.
It's okay, baby. Go that way. Okay, go ahead. Go in my room. Sorry, that was one of my babies. Anyway, where was I at? We're going to go back to 14. But they did not obey. They stiffened their necks like their fathers who did not have faith in the Lord their God. They spurned his laws and the covenant that he had made with their fathers, and the warnings he had given them. They went after delusion and were deluded. They imitated the nations that were about them, which the Lord had forbidden them to emulate. They rejected all the commandments of the Lord their God. They made molten idols for themselves, 2 calves, and they made a sacred post, and they bowed down to all the host of heaven, and they worshipped Baal. They consigned their sons and daughters to the fire. They practiced augury and divination, and gave themselves over to what was displeasing to the Lord, and vexed him. The Lord was incensed at Israel, and he banished them from his presence. None was left but the tribe of Judah alone. Nor did Judah keep the commandments of the Lord their God. They followed the customs that Israel had practiced. So the Lord spurned all the offspring of Israel, and he afflicted them and delivered them into the hands of plunderers. And finally, he cast them out from his presence. For Israel broke away from the house of David, and they made Jeroboam, son of Nebat, king. And Jeroboam caused Israel to stray from the Lord and to commit great sin, and the Israelites persisted in all the sins which Jeroboam had committed. They did not depart from them. In the end, the Lord removed Israel from his presence, as he had warned them through all his servants the prophets. So the Israelites were deported from their land to Assyria, as is still the case. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and he settled them in the towns of Samaria in place of the Israelites. Now, these places are some of the same places that he was just asking King Hezekiah, that he asked King Hezekiah, where were they gods and they kings at when I conquered them and deported them? Where were they? They didn't save them. Why you think your God gonna save you? These are some of the same places. It says the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and he settled them in the towns of Samaria in place of the Israelites. So he deported the Israelites and then sent some foreigners to go live there in their place. They took possession of Samaria and dwelt in its towns. When they first settled there, they did not worship the Lord. So the Lord sent lions against them, which killed some of them. They said to the king of Assyria, the nations which you deported and resettled in the towns of Samaria do not know the rules of the God of the land. Therefore he has let lions loose against them, which are killing them, for they do not know the rules of the God of the land. The king of Assyria gave an order, send there one of the priests whom you have deported. Let him go and dwell there, and let him teach them the practices of the God of the land. So one of the priests whom they had exiled from Samaria came and settled in Bethel. He taught them how to worship the Lord. However, each nation continued to make its own gods and to set them up in the cult places which had been made by the people of Samaria. Each nation set them up in the towns in which it lived. The Babylonians made Succoth-Benoth, and the men of Cuth made Nergal, and the men of Hamath made Ashima, and the Avites made Nibhaz and Tartak, and the Sepharvites burned their children as offerings to Adramelech and Anamelech, the gods of Sepharvaim. They worshipped the Lord, but they also appointed from their own ranks priests of the shrines who officiated for them in the cult places. They worshiped the Lord while serving their own gods, according to the practices of the nations from which they had been deported. Kind of like how Christians, they worship the Father, but they also worship Jesus. Anyway, continuing on. They do not follow the laws and practices. Oh, wait, I skipped a part. Wait a minute. They worship the Lord while serving their own gods according to the practices of the nations from which they had been deported. To this day, they follow their former practices. They do not worship the Lord properly. They do not follow the laws and practices, the teaching and instruction that the Lord enjoined upon the descendants of Jacob, who was given the name Israel, with whom he made a covenant and whom he commanded, you shall worship no other gods. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them, nor sacrifice to them. You must worship only the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt with great might and with an outstretched arm. To him alone shall you bow down, and to him alone shall you sacrifice. You shall observe faithfully all your days the laws and the practices, the teaching and instruction that I wrote down for you. Do not worship other gods. Do not forget the covenant that I made with you. Do not worship other gods. Worship only the Lord your God, and he will serve you from the hands of all your enemies. Did anybody else notice that the Father said the same thing 6 times in 3 different verses? Back to back to back, he said the same thing 6 different times, 6 different ways in 3 different verses. Did anybody notice that? Do not worship other gods. Worship the Father only. Him only shall you serve. Do not worship other gods. He is God all by himself. He is God alone. Did anybody else notice that? I was just curious. Anyway, those nations worship the Lord, but they also served their idols. To this day, their children and their children's children do as their ancestors did. That was chapter 17 of 2 Kings. Now, we've already found out that King Hoshea made the king of Assyria angry because they had stopped paying tribute, which was, they need to be paying tribute. You got beat up. You're supposed to be paying tribute. Well, he rebelled against them because he felt like, no, King Pekah got beat up, and I killed King Pekah 8 years after you beat him up, and they started paying you guys tribute, and King Pekah was no longer king over Israel. King Hoshea killed him and took over and rebelled against Assyria. He wasn't finna keep paying Assyria anything. And he went to Egypt and to ask for help. And it made the king of Assyria angry, the new king of Assyria angry. And so now we back dealing with Judah. It says, in the third year of King Hoshea, this is chapter 18. In the third year of King Hoshea, son of Elah of Israel, Hezekiah, son of King Ahaz of Judah, became king. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 29 years. His mother's name was Abi, daughter of Zechariah. He did what was pleasing to the Lord, just as his father David had done. He abolished the shrines and smashed the pillars and cut down the sacred post. He also broke into pieces the bronze serpent that Moses has made, for until that time the Israelites had been offering sacrifices to it. It was called Nehushtan. He trusted only in the Lord, the God of Israel. What's kind of interesting about that, just as a side note, was a passage of scripture in the New Testament where Yahushua told them, just as the bronze serpent was lifted up in the desert, I shall be lifted up. Now, he meant that he was going to be hung on a pole. But it's still kind of, you have to kind of think about that, because Nehushtan was, the bronze serpent that they named Nehushtan was something that Moses had made, that the Father told him to make for them to look upon, because the Father had sent a bunch of serpents to bite them in the wilderness, because the Israelites had made the Father upset when Moses was taking them through the wilderness. And so Moses went to the Father on their behalf, and so the Father had him, okay, well, make this bronze serpent and hold it up, and whoever looks upon it shall be healed from these snake bites. And so that's what happened. Well, they turned that bronze serpent into a god and named it Nehushtan and started worshiping it. They held it up in high esteem, and I'm assuming because of what it was intentionally used for, that it was being worshipped for healing. It was being worshipped as a god of healing. So that kind of, I don't know if you guys are following my train of thought with that, but I just thought it was interesting that was one of the things that is recorded that Yahushua said was, just as Nehushtan was, just as the bronze serpent was lifted up in the desert, so the Son of Man shall be lifted up. Y'all took a son of man, y'all took a human being, and y'all lifted him up, and y'all made him y'all savior, y'all's healer, y'all's God the Son. It's a no-no. And don't get me wrong, I did it too. It's one of those things where you automatically think about that passage of scripture in Jeremiah where he said that our people have inherited a delusion. We have inherited a delusion. But anyway, going back to what I was reading. He trusted only in the Lord, the God of Israel. There was none like him among all the kings of Judah after him, nor among those before him. He clung to the Lord. He did not turn away from following him, but kept the commandments that the Lord had given to Moses. And the Lord was always with him. He was successful wherever he turned. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and would not serve him. He overran Philistia as far as Gaza and its border areas, from watchtower to fortified town. In the 4th year of King Hezekiah, which was the 7th year of King Hoshea, son of Elah of Israel, King Shalmaneser of Assyria marched against Samaria and besieged it, and he captured it at the end of 3 years. In the 6th year of Hezekiah, which was the 9th year of King Hoshea of Israel, Samaria was captured. It's repeating what it said in 17. And the king of Assyria deported the Israelites to Assyria. He settled them in Halah along the Habor and the river Gozan and in the towns of Media. This happened because they did not obey the Lord their God. They transgressed his covenant, all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. They did not obey, and they did not fulfill it. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, King Sennacherib of Assyria marched against all the fortified towns of Judah and seized them. King Hezekiah sent this message to the king of Assyria at Lachish: I have done wrong, withdraw from me, and I shall bear whatever you impose on me. So the king of Assyria imposed upon King Hezekiah of Judah a payment of 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was on hand in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the palace. At that time, Hezekiah cut down the doors and the doorposts of the temple of the Lord, which King Hezekiah had overlaid with gold, and gave them to the king of Assyria. Y'all give me just 1 second. Okay, I'm back. I had to handle something. But anyway, we just got done reading 2 Kings chapter 18. Verse 16. Okay, now I'm in 17. But the king of Assyria sent the Tartan, the Rabsaris, and the Rabshakeh from Lachish with a large force to King Hezekiah in Jerusalem. They marched up to Jerusalem, and when they arrived, they took up a position near the conduit of the upper pool by the road of the fuller's field. They summoned the king, and Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, who was in charge of the palace, Shebna the scribe, and Joah, son of Asaph, the recorder, went out to them. Now, everything after that is a repeat of Isaiah 36 and 37 and of 2 Chronicles chapter 32. We don't have to read that again. But basically, where I'm coming from with this is that everything that I've read here so far says that the prophecy that was repeated, or the piece of the prophecy, because that's another thing that I'm seeing happen, that's happened a couple of times just in the first 2 chapters of Matthew, is that we're taking bits and pieces of a prophecy and ascribing them to something that didn't have anything to do with the prophecy as a whole. It didn't even have anything to do with that same time frame. And that's something that I don't understand why it was done. And it's got to stop. If I was to give my own personal feelings about it, which that's what I'm doing, it's my video. It's got to stop. It's got to stop. There is one God, one, and you got to worship him and him only. All this extra, you got to let that go. The delusions that we inherited, all that stuff, you have to let all that go. All that's got to be let go of. And I think one of the things that helped me a lot with letting go of doing things that I grew up doing. Like I said in the last couple of videos, Jesus is a hard habit to break. I grew up with Jesus. That's a hard habit to break, but I had to break it. And one of the things that helped me was to stop just reading the Bible as like it's just one big, you just read it from cover to cover and you just let it go. No, you got to break those scriptures down, especially considering the fact that the Bible is put together in a way where you have to kind of bounce around, because if you're just reading from cover to cover, you're not going to understand what's going on. And so just hearing certain things, you're like, oh, okay, that fits. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. And so break them scriptures down. Even if it takes you a week or two to get all of that stuff together and lined up and be like, okay, this right here doesn't match up with this. So why do we keep saying that that's where this came from? Because there are a lot of places in the New Testament where Old Testament scriptures are supposed to be the foundation of where those New Testament verses came from. But when you actually are sitting down and you're studying them, you're like, how? Like, how? And one of those things is with these prophecies. You can't just take a verse out of the middle of a prophecy and say, that verse right there was about Yahusha. That verse right there was about Jesus. Now, all 6 of these other verses was about this incident right here. But that one verse in the middle was about Yahusha. No. Either all of it was about him or none of it was about him. And none of Micah 5:1 was about Jesus. None of that was about Jesus. None of it. That's where I'm at right now. This is gonna be the end of part 1. I'm gonna end it there, and I will see you guys later. Bye.